The respiratory system. The primary function of the respiratory system is gas exchange between the body and the atmosphere. So oxygen from the air comes into the lungs as we inhale. From the lungs to the blood carries the oxygen to the cells of the body where they use it for cellular respiration. Cellular respiration generates carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide diffuses out of cells into the blood. The blood carries it to the air sacs of the lungs, where the carbon dioxide ultimately is exhaled from the body. The respiratory system includes the larynx, which allows us to generate sounds that we can shape into words. The larynx is our voice box. The nose provides a sense of smell, and that's part of the respiratory system. And the respiratory system helps to regulate what's called acid-base balance within the body. This would be the pH scale, and the pH scale ranges from 0 to 14, with a pH of 7 as neutral. So any pH below 7 is said to be an acid pH, and a pH above 7 would be an alkaline pH, or a basic pH. This shows the normal range of pH within the blood, and it ranges normally from 7.35 to 7.45 with an average blood pH of 7.4. So that means the blood pH is slightly alkaline or slightly basic. If the pH of blood goes above 7.45, the body is said to be in a state of alkalosis. And if the pH of blood drops below 7.35, the body is said to be in a state of acidosis. So the pH of blood, if it drops to like 7.3 or 7.2 or 7.1, is still basic or alkaline, but the body is said to be in a state of acidosis because it's outside of the normal range towards the acidic side. So the blood pH has this range, and the normal blood pH should be somewhere around 7.4. The trend in the body is towards acidosis, where the pH of blood drops below 7.35. If the pH of blood drops to 7.2, a person gets very, very sick and can even become unconscious. If the pH of blood drops to 6.9, below 7, you're probably going to slip away into a coma. And if the pH of blood drops to 6.8, you would be dead. So the cells of the body generate CO2, and the CO2 reacts with water to form carbonic acid that dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. You have to exhale the CO2 out of the body in order for it not to accumulate within the fluid compartments of the body. If CO2 accumulates in the fluid compartments of the body, it drives the reaction in that direction and generates excessive numbers of hydrogen ions, which can lower the blood pH because the pH is inversely proportional to the hydrogen ion concentration. And as the hydrogen ion concentration goes up, the pH goes down towards acid pHs. So if the pH of blood drops outside of the normal range, then you're in a state of acidosis, and the pH values associated with acidosis will disrupt the activity of enzymes throughout the body, and that can lead to the death of cells. And of course, if your cells are not doing well at some point in time, you become very, very sick, and that can be lethal. So just to review cellular respiration, it's a biochemical pathway that makes ATP. And cells must make ATP because certain reactions that are critical to the metabolism of cells are dependent on ATP. Oxygen is necessary because it's one of the participants in the aerobic stages of cellular respiration that occur in the mitochondria. So cellular respiration reacts oxygen with organic compounds like glucose and fatty acids and forms products, carbon dioxide and water, and in the process makes a lot of ATP. So we're going to find that a person at rest takes about 12 breaths per minute. That's one breath every 5 seconds. And the body produces a couple hundred milliliters of carbon dioxide each minute. So the cells of your body are always producing carbon dioxide and always using oxygen in order to make ATP by cellular respiration. So we'll talk about some of the organs of the respiratory system, beginning with the nose. The nasal bones form the bridge of the nose, and extending from the ends of the nasal bones is a hyaline cartilage that gives shape to the nose. The nostrils are openings into the nasal cavities. They're called the external nares. Within the nose are nasal hairs that act as barriers to prevent large particles and small bugs from getting access to the throat. The nasal cavities are hollow spaces within the nose that are separated by a partition called the nasal septum. The nasal cavities are lined with a mucous membrane made of simple columnar epithelium that's interspersed with goblet cells that make mucus. Olfactory cells are found at the top of each nasal cavity, and they're associated with olfaction, or your sense of smell. The hard palate is a bony plate between the oral cavity or the mouth and the nasal cavities. It's formed by the maxillary bones and the palatine bones. Coming off the end of the hard palate near the rear of the mouth is the soft palate. And it's an arch of skeletal muscle that includes what's known as the uvula. The uvula is the portion of the soft palate that swings up when you swallow to seal off the nasopharynx. And that helps to direct food that you swallow down the pharynx towards the esophagus. Incoming air doesn't contain generally all of the moisture that it can possibly hold. And as a result, that incoming air, if it makes its way down into the lungs, can draw moisture off the cells that line the air tubes and dry out the lungs. So the incoming air, to prevent the drying out of the lungs, is humidified as it moves through the nasal cavities. And the humidification means that the nasal mucosa evaporates water associated with it into the incoming air to add moisture to it or humidify it before it goes down into the pharynx and the lungs. At the ends of the nasal cavities are openings called the internal nares, and they open up into the upper portion of the pharynx, which is called the nasopharynx. There are 4 bones around the nasal cavities: the frontal, sphenoid, ethmoid, and maxillary bones that contain air-filled cavities known as paranasal sinuses. The paranasal sinuses help to reduce the weight of these skull bones, hence the weight of the skull. There is a duct from the corner of your eyes that leads down into the nasal mucosa, known as the nasolacrimal duct, and it's a way of carrying lacrimal fluid that flows across the eye into the nasal mucosa. The pharynx is also called your throat, and it's a passageway that is shared by both the digestive and the respiratory systems. So the pharynx is divided into three sections. The upper section is the nasopharynx. Behind the mouth is the oropharynx, and then beside the larynx is the laryngopharynx. There's a tube that runs from the middle ear cavity that opens into the nasopharynx called the pharyngotympanic tube. The larynx is your voice box, and it's found in the neck. Its walls are made of hyaline cartilage, and the larynx contains the vocal cords. The larynx appears as a bump in your neck called the laryngeal prominence. There's an opening on the side of the pharynx called the glottis, and that's an opening on the side of the pharynx into the larynx. The glottis is protected by a flap of elastic cartilage called the epiglottis. So when you swallow, the uvula of the soft palate swings up to seal off the nasopharynx, and the epiglottis swings down over the glottis. And that helps to direct food and whatever you're drinking down the pharynx to the esophagus, and from there to the stomach. Within the larynx, or the voice box, are your vocal cords, also called vocal folds. And there are two bands of skeletal muscle and elastic connective tissue that are stretched across the walls of the larynx. When you exhale, the vocal cords vibrate and create sounds. And then we modify or shape those sounds, generally by moving or wiggling the tongue and changing the shape of the mouth. You can't talk without moving the tongue in order to shape sounds into meaningful, intelligible words. There are sex differences in the size of the larynx and the thickness of the vocal cords. At puberty, males start to secrete testosterone from their testes, and the testosterone from the testes in guys causes the larynx to get bigger and the vocal cords to thicken. Both of these structural changes in the larynx as a result of testosterone cause the voice of middle school boys, somewhere around the age of 12, when they're in 7th grade, to deepen. The trachea is also known as the windpipe, and it's a tube in the neck that's about 4 inches long, and it's a fairly large tube with a diameter of about an inch. It's held open by C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage in its walls that prevent it from collapsing when you inhale, and lined with a mucous membrane made of ciliated, pseudostratified columnar epithelium interspersed with mucus-secreting goblet cells. So this would be the larynx and the trachea, and over here would be the laryngopharynx. So there's an opening called the glottis on the side of the laryngopharynx, guarded by the epiglottis, that opens into the larynx where the vocal cords are found. What I want to show you is the mucociliary elevator associated with the trachea. It's a self-cleansing mechanism associated with the air tubes of the lungs. So the open space within a tube is called its lumen, and this would be the lumen of the trachea. Of course, this would be the lumen of the larynx, the lumen of the pharynx. The lumen of the trachea is lined by pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells that have cilia at their apical end, the end that faces the lumen. And intermixed among the columnar cells are goblet cells that secrete mucus. So I show the coating of mucus on top of the cilia in yellow. Dust particles, pollen grains, lint, little flakes of cotton that flake off the clothes you wear, sort of waft around in the air, and they'll come in to your lungs as you inhale. And as they do, they stick to the mucus, and the cilia beat in a coordinated fashion to move the mucus and anything stuck into it, like dust particles, up the trachea, through the larynx, through the glottis, and into the pharynx, where it can be swallowed. And this combination of mucus and the beating of the cilia to move anything that comes into the lungs with the air you inhale is referred to as the mucociliary elevator. The mucociliary elevator is important because it prevents particles that come in with inhaled air from tumbling down and reaching the air sacs of the lung, where if they accumulated, over a lifetime, they would eventually smother out the air sacs and prevent you from exchanging gases. So the particles, like dust particles, lint, pollen grains, etc., stick to the mucus, and then the mucus moves along the tips of the cilia, always up and away from the air sacs, through the larynx, into the pharynx, where you can swallow the mucus and anything trapped in it. Cigarette smoke decreases the effectiveness of the mucociliary elevator at keeping the lungs clean, because cigarette smoke will not only damage the cilia, but decrease the number of cilia over time. It'll also increase the secretion of mucus by goblet cells, and this excess mucus can clog the airways and accumulate in the larynx. The mucus that can accumulate in the larynx with people who smoke inhibits the vocal cords from vibrating properly, and as a result, a smoker over time develops a raspy or hoarse voice. You can usually tell the voice of a cigarette smoker. And cigarette smokers over time also will develop what's known as a smoker's cough. And that's because they have excessive mucus that accumulates in the air tubes and the larynx, and they'll cough in order to push that mucus out of the larynx into the pharynx, where they can swallow it. The trachea leads to a branching system of air tubes known as the bronchial tree, and it's made up of the bronchi and the bronchioles. So bronchus with a US is singular. Change the US to an I, it becomes plural. The bronchial tree extends from the end of the trachea, doesn't include the trachea, and goes all the way to the bronchioles. It includes the bronchioles. The alveoli are not part of the bronchial tree. The bronchi are lined with a mucous membrane that is part of the mucociliary elevator. The trachea behind the heart in the mediastinum branches into two primary bronchi that go into each lung at the hilum of the lung. The hilum of the lung is the middle part of the lung that faces the mediastinum. So the bronchi are held open like the trachea by plates of hyaline cartilage in the walls, so they don't collapse as you inhale. The bronchioles are the smallest airways, and they generally are less than a millimeter in diameter. They do not have cartilage in their walls, and they are not lined with a mucous membrane. So the bronchioles are surrounded by smooth muscle cells that regulate the diameter of the bronchioles, and control how much air then can go into and out of the lungs as you breathe. The bronchioles eventually lead to alveolar ducts that open into alveolar sacs. There are several factors that affect the diameter of bronchioles. And again, just to emphasize, the bronchioles are surrounded by smooth muscle cells. So if you contract the smooth muscle cells, the diameter of the tube decreases. And if you relax the smooth muscle cells, the diameter of the tubes increases. So a contraction of the smooth muscle causes bronchoconstriction, and a relaxation of the smooth muscle causes bronchodilation. The smooth muscle cells are regulated primarily by the autonomic nervous system, which has two divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. So the sympathetic or adrenergic effect occurs in response to stressors like exercise and will be mediated by epinephrine and norepinephrine. And epi and norepi cause the smooth muscle cells to relax. That increases the diameter of the bronchioles, in other words, causes bronchodilation. And the larger these air tubes are, the more air that can go into and out of the lungs, and that's an advantage when you are exercising because it allows more oxygen delivered to the cells of the body and a way of exhaling the additional CO2 that you generate during exercise. The parasympathetic effects, which are associated with resting breathing, are mediated through acetylcholine, so they're cholinergic effects, and they cause the smooth muscle cells around the bronchioles to contract. That leads to bronchoconstriction, really returning the bronchioles to their resting diameter when one is taking resting breaths. Histamines are chemicals secreted by mast cells found in the lungs in response to allergens like pollen grains or animal dander. So dander would be little flakes of skin that are shed by cats, dogs, farm animals, and they float around in the air and come in to your lungs when you inhale. And these allergens can stimulate mast cells in the lungs to secrete chemicals known as histamine. And the histamines cause the smooth muscle cells around the bronchioles to contract, which causes bronchoconstriction. In other words, the airway diameter decreases and the bronchioles become smaller tubes. So that makes it more difficult to breathe. If one is having trouble breathing as a result of an allergy, they might take drugs called antihistamines to block the effect of the histamines, and that makes it easier to breathe. The alveoli. So alveolus is singular, and change the US to an I, it becomes alveoli. That's the plural form. The alveoli are also called air sacs, and they are microscopic and very numerous. So there's about 150 million alveoli per lung. So when you add that up across the two lungs, you realize that there's about 300 million alveoli in both lungs all total. Living within the alveoli are cells called dust cells. They're also known as alveolar macrophages, and they live in the alveoli and phagocytize or eat bacteria and any dead cells to keep the air sacs free of debris. The alveoli group together to form what are known as alveolar sacs within the lung lobules. Alveolar ducts are little tubes at the end of respiratory bronchioles that lead into an alveolar sac. In general, there's around 20 to 30 alveoli per alveolar sac. So this would be a respiratory bronchiole that leads to an alveolar duct, and the alveolar duct opens into an alveolar sac. All of the alveoli are covered by pulmonary capillaries, and the gas exchange occurs between the air spaces in the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries. So this would be a pulmonary arteriole, colored blue on the model, because it's carrying blood that's low in oxygen, high in CO2, into pulmonary capillaries where gas exchange occurs. The pulmonary capillaries are drained by pulmonary venules, which would be colored red on our model. And when the blood from the pulmonary arterioles comes into pulmonary capillaries, carbon dioxide diffuses into the air sacs or alveoli so it can be exhaled. And the oxygen that comes in as you inhale diffuses into the capillaries. And the CO2 going out of the capillaries, the oxygen coming in is an exchange where these two gases are moving in opposite directions, and that's why it's called gas exchange. Elastic fibers. There is an extensive network of elastic fibers that cover the alveoli throughout the lungs. And these elastic fibers act like rubber bands. So the elastic fibers are very stretchy. And we're going to find that when the lungs expand during inhalation, the elastic fibers stretch. And then when you exhale, the elastic fibers will recoil back to their original length and push air out of the lungs. The two layers of simple squamous, the simple squamous of the capillary wall and the simple squamous that makes up the alveolar wall, together form what's known as the respiratory membrane. The wall of the alveoli is made up of epithelial cells, but there are two types of epithelial cells. By far the most common type, making up 95% of the epithelial cells, are called type 1 alveolar cells. They're simple squamous epithelium. There's another type of cell found in the wall of alveoli called a type 2 alveolar cell, and they make up no more than 5% of the total. They are cells that are cuboidal in shape and secrete a chemical known as pulmonary surfactant. Pulmonary surfactant is a lipoprotein that's secreted by the type 2 alveolar cells in the wall of the alveoli, and the lipoprotein known as pulmonary surfactant is secreted into a thin film of water that coats the inner surface of each alveolus. And the surfactant that mixes into this film of water decreases its surface tension. The surface tension is something that has to be overcome as the alveoli expand, and by decreasing surface tension, it makes it easier to expand the alveoli during inhalation. There's a term that I want you to know called compliance, and compliance refers to the ease at which the lungs expand when you inhale. And surfactant is a chemical that increases lung compliance, or makes it easier for the lungs to expand during inhalation by reducing the surface tension of the film of water that coats the inside of the alveoli. There's a condition that occurs in babies that are born prematurely. These babies are called preemies. known as neonatal respiratory distress syndrome. And it's a breathing disorder that occurs in the birth of a newborn that's more than 6 weeks premature. So very little surfactant is produced by the alveolar type 2 cells until about 4 to 6 weeks before a normal due date. A preemie that's born 4 to 6 weeks early or later than that doesn't make enough surfactant to decrease the surface tension of the layer of water on their alveoli, and the result is that it's very difficult for these premature kids or preemies to expand their lungs during inhalation. In fact, it can be so difficult that these kids are put into a positive pressure ventilator where the air literally is kind of forced into their lungs, and they receive what's called a surfactant spray. You can spray a mist that contains surfactant into their lungs to provide them with the surfactant necessary to reduce that surface tension. And they stay in the positive pressure ventilator until their lungs start to make enough surfactant. RAS is the renin-angiotensin system, and it is associated with cells in the lungs that contain an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme. It's generally referred to as ACE. And ACE is an important part of the RAS system that helps to regulate blood pressure. So if the kidney senses that the blood pressure has dropped below normal, then kidney cells release renin, and renin converts a plasma protein made in the liver called angiotensinogen that circulates at all times to angiotensin 1. And then angiotensin 1 circulates with the blood coming out of the kidney and travels to the lungs, where ACE converts it to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is a very potent vasoconstrictor, more potent even than epinephrine. And angiotensin 2 will vasoconstrict arterioles, raising the peripheral resistance, which will bring blood pressure back to normal. The lungs are found in the thoracic cavity. There's a space between them where the heart is located called the mediastinum. The hilum, also called the hilus, is a region on the medial side of each lung where the primary bronchi enter, blood vessels go in and out. There are 2 lobes associated with the left lung, superior and inferior. The lobes of the lung are organized into units called lobules, and each of the lobules consist of several alveolar sacs. Each lung is surrounded by a double-walled sac called the pleura. And the pleura consists of 2 layers. Sometimes the layers are called membranes. So the pleura consists of a visceral pleura and a parietal pleura. And the visceral and the parietal pleura membranes together make up the pleura. And there's a pleura around each lung. So the visceral pleura is the inner layer, and it adheres very tightly to the surface of the lung. The visceral pleura will reflex or fold back on itself at the hilum to form the parietal pleura. The parietal pleura is the outer layer, and it is attached firmly across the top of the diaphragm and attached firmly to the thoracic wall. There is a space between the pleural membranes called the pleural cavity, sometimes known as the intrapleural cavity. And it's a space between the visceral and the parietal pleural membranes that's filled with a watery serous fluid called the pleural fluid. The pleural fluid found between the two layers of the pleura actually causes these membranes to stick together. So it turns out that if you take a couple of slides, glass slides, and put them together, you find that it's pretty easy to pull them apart. But if you take some water and create a thin film of water on one of the slides and then stick the other slide to it, the thin film of water between the slides acts as a glue that holds these slides together and prevents you from pulling them apart. So the visceral and the parietal pleural membranes are kind of like the two slides, and they are stuck together by the watery fluid in the cavity between them. So wherever one of the pleural membranes go, the other one travels with it because they are stuck together. Plus remember that the visceral pleura is stuck to the surface of the lung, and the parietal pleura is stuck to the top of the diaphragm and thoracic wall. So this is a drawing showing the two layers of the pleura. So this would be the trachea that branches into primary bronchi, and the primary bronchi enter into the lungs at the hilum. Within the lungs, the primary bronchi branch repeatedly and eventually to the alveoli. So this is a simplification, obviously, because there'd be about 150 million of these alveoli and many branching air tubes within each lung. I've only drawn it on one side for the sake of simplicity, but of course everything on this side would be duplicated on the other side because everything would be the same for both lungs. So, the pleura consist of a parietal and a visceral pleura. And the two layers together make up one pleura that surrounds each lung. So the visceral pleura is attached to the surface of the lungs, and it folds back on itself at the hilum to form the parietal pleura, which is attached to the thoracic wall, as well as to the top of the diaphragm. The visceral and the parietal pleural membranes are stuck together by the watery solution in the pleural cavity. The pleural layers are important, and the fact that they're attached to the thoracic wall and the diaphragm and move together because the pleura allows the lungs to literally hang from the thoracic wall, and that prevents the lungs from collapsing. So the lungs are stuck to the thoracic wall. The parietal pleura is anchored to the thoracic wall, and the visceral pleura is stuck to the parietal pleura. So if the parietal pleura is stuck to the thoracic wall, the visceral pleura is stuck to the thoracic wall as well. And that makes sure that the lungs are stuck to the thoracic wall and can't collapse. A pneumothorax occurs if an individual gets a puncture wound to the chest. So the pneumothorax occurs if air through a puncture wound to the chest, say a knife wound or a bullet wound or some kind of puncture wound associated with a automobile accident, if air gets through a hole in the chest into the pleural cavity, it'll cause the visceral and parietal pleural membranes to separate, and the lungs will pull away from the thoracic wall and collapse. And when this occurs, you have what's called air in the pleural cavity, and that's known as a pneumothorax, where pneumo means air. The treatment is to close the puncture wound and then suction the air out of the pleural cavity so the two membranes will stick together and the lungs will once more hang from the thoracic wall without collapsing. I want to mention just a little bit about gas pressures associated with breathing. So there are pressure changes that are used to discuss breathing, and we'll be using what are called relative pressures. So it turns out that all pressures are positive, but when you use a relative pressure scale, you can create negative pressures and talk about negative pressures. So let's look at absolute pressures, and they're all going to be positive. And then we'll convert these absolute pressures to a relative pressure scale. So let's say we've got an absolute pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury, and on our relative scale, we set that pressure to 0. If the absolute pressure then goes from 760 to 762, then on our relative scale, it would have gone from 0 to +2. If, on the other hand, the absolute pressure drops from 760 to 758, then on a relative pressure scale, the 758 would be a -2, and it's referred to as a negative pressure. So we're going to find that negative pressure is created in the alveoli of the lungs that make up the intrapulmonary space when you inhale. So we're going to find out that humans are negative pressure ventilators. And that's because the expansion of the lungs during inhalation creates a negative pressure within the intrapulmonary spaces within the alveoli of the lungs, and that draws air into the lungs. We'll always find that air will move down a pressure gradient into a negative pressure space. A negative pressure space is also known as a vacuum. So let's say that we have two rooms. One's A and the other's room B. And they're separated by a wall with a hole in it that the air can travel through. And let's say that the absolute pressure of the air in room A is 760 millimeters of mercury. And we're going to set that to 0 millimeters of mercury on our relative scale. So over here in room B, let's say that the absolute pressure of the air within that room is 757 millimeters of mercury. In other words, 3 less than room A. So we would, on our relative scale, call that a -3 millimeters of mercury, or a negative pressure. So this then is a negative pressure space on our relative pressure scale, and air will go from room A, where the pressure is higher, through this opening into room B, moving along a pressure gradient and into a negative pressure space, or a vacuum. We're going to look next at the mechanics of pulmonary ventilation. That's kind of a fancy way of saying breathing. So each breath consists of an inhalation and an exhalation. Sometimes an inhalation is referred to as inspiration and an exhalation as expiration. So a resting breath takes about 5 seconds. An individual then would take about 12 breaths per minute in a resting state. The inspiration takes 2 seconds generally, followed by an expiration that lasts 3 seconds, 5 seconds all total. We're going to look at the events that occur during inspiration with a quiet breath. So normally, an individual who is at rest breathes in a way where you can't hear the breathing. And so a resting breath, generally because someone sitting next to you can't hear you breathing is also called a quiet breath. So quiet breath or resting breath, they mean the same thing. So when inspiration occurs during a quiet or resting breath, there are a couple skeletal muscles associated with each breath. And they include the diaphragm, which is the major muscle of breathing, as well as the 11 pairs of external intercostal muscles. The external intercostal muscles are skeletal muscles found between the ribs. The prime mover of inhalation is the contraction of the diaphragm. So inspiration is known as an active process since it requires the contraction of these skeletal muscles. And we're going to find that expiration is a passive process because it occurs without the need of contracting skeletal muscle. The diaphragm is the most important muscle for inhalation. And when it contracts, about 65% of all the air that's going to come into the lungs will come into the lungs. The diaphragm is dome-shaped at rest when it's not contracting, and then it flattens out. So it's dome-shaped at rest, and then it flattens out when it contracts during inhalation. And when the diaphragm contracts, it pulls down on the lungs and causes them to expand. The contraction of the diaphragm also causes pressure and volume changes in the thoracic and abdominal cavities in accordance with Boyle's law that says the pressure, in this case air pressure, is inversely proportional to the volume. So as the volume goes up, the air pressure goes down. As the volume goes down, the air pressure goes up. Both these variables, if they're inversely related, are moving in opposite directions. So when the diaphragm contracts, the volume of the thoracic cavity will increase and the air pressure within it will decrease. And this causes the lungs to be pulled towards the mediastinum, and they will expand towards the mediastinum as a result. The external intercostals are skeletal muscles found between the ribs. There's 11 pairs of them all total, and they account for about 35% of the air that comes in when you inhale. So the external intercostals, when they contract, cause the sternum and the rib cage to move up and outward, and that causes the lungs to expand. It also increases the volume and drops the air pressure within the thoracic cavity as well. So here's an illustration that shows the lungs at rest, and then the diaphragm and external intercostal muscles will contract as one inhales, and that creates changes that we see over here that occur when one inhales. So the spaces made up by the alveoli and the air tubes inside the lungs are known as the intrapulmonary space. And we would talk about the intrapulmonary volume and the intrapulmonary pressure, referring to volume and pressure changes that occur in the intrapulmonary space. When the lungs are in a resting state, the diaphragm is dome-shaped. Now, when one inhales, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles contract. When the diaphragm contracts, it flattens, and that pulls down on the lungs, causing the lungs to expand. It also increases the volume and decreases the air pressure within the thoracic cavity, which pulls the lungs towards the mediastinum and causes them to expand. So the contraction of the diaphragm when it flattens causes the lungs to expand. When the external intercostal muscles contract, the chest is raised, causes the lungs to expand because the parietal pleura moves with the thoracic wall, and the visceral pleura that's stuck to the parietal pleura by the thin film of water in the pleural cavity moves with the parietal pleura, and the lifting of the sternum in the rib cage, or expansion of the thoracic wall, causes the lungs to expand outward as well. This illustration shows the pressure changes that occur when the lungs expand. So here we are at rest, and the atmospheric pressure, let's say, is 760 millimeters of mercury on an absolute pressure scale. And the relative pressure we're going to set to 0. So we're going to say that 760 millimeters of mercury on a relative scale is 0. The atmospheric pressure when the diaphragm is at rest and dome shape is going to be the same as the pressure found within the alveoli. So if it's 0 millimeters of mercury as our atmospheric pressure on a relative scale, it would be 0 millimeters of mercury as the air pressure within the alveoli. When the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles contract, the lungs expand, and that is going to cause all the alveoli to expand and get bigger. As the volume within the intrapulmonary space increases, the air pressure within the alveoli drops by about 3 millimeters of mercury, from 760 to 757, which on our relative pressure scale would be a -3, or a negative pressure. So when the lungs expand, this pressure volume change, an increase in volume and a drop in pressure, creates a negative pressure space within the alveoli, and that creates the pressure gradient that draws air into the lungs. So when the lungs expand during inhalation, air is sucked into the lungs along a pressure gradient, and as a result, we are known as negative pressure ventilators, because expansion of the lungs creates a negative pressure, or a vacuum, in the intrapulmonary spaces that draws air in. During a resting inhalation, which is an active process, it involves the contraction of the diaphragm and the external intercostals, the lungs and the alveoli expand, and expansion causes the following to occur. You'll see an increase in the intrapulmonary volume by about 500 mils. That's 250 mils per lung, and that would be the tidal volume. And a decrease in the intrapulmonary air pressure by around 3 millimeters of mercury to create a negative pressure space within the alveoli. And air then in the atmosphere would move down this pressure gradient into the alveoli. And at the height of inspiration, of course, gas exchange occurs where CO2 leaves blood, goes into the alveoli so it can be exhaled. And the oxygen that comes in as you inhale is going to go into the blood capillaries. Expiration during a quiet or resting breath is a passive process that occurs when the inspiratory muscles, the diaphragm and the external intercostals, relax. When those muscles relax, expiration or an exhalation occurs. So during inspiration, the lungs expand, and as the lungs expand, you stretch the elastic fibers that form an extensive network throughout the lungs, and they gain potential energy as they stretch. And then when the skeletal muscles of inhalation relax, those stretched elastic fibers recoil back to their original length and push air out of the lungs. So it's a little reminiscent of a balloon. So I'm going to blow up. Okay, so I've got air in the lungs, And as you inhale, this active process that involves the contraction of skeletal muscle, the lungs expand. And as the lungs expand, the elastic fibers within the lungs stretch. And then when you exhale, the stretched elastic fibers simply recoil back to their original length, and that pushes air out of the lungs. So it would be something like this. And that's the elastic fibers returning to their original length, pushing air out of the lungs. And this is referred to as elastic recoil. So the elastic recoil of elastic fibers is what blows air out of the lungs as you exhale. I do want you to know the respiratory volumes and a couple of the capacities. So just recall that a milliliter is a volume that you can fit into a cubic centimeter. A cubic centimeter isn't generally written centimeter cubed. Instead, it's written as a cc, where cc stands for cubic centimeter. And that means that a milliliter and a cubic centimeter define the same volume. So when volumes are given, they're given often in either milliliters or cc's, where these units are equivalent to one another. So we're going to find that respiratory volumes and capacities vary by sex. Guys on average are taller than females and have larger lungs as a result. So these are going to be average values for males. So tidal volume, which I'll abbreviate TV, is the amount of air going into the lungs as you inhale or out of the lungs as you exhale. So tidal volume is how much air goes into the lungs or how much air goes out of the lungs as you take a breath, and it's about 500 mils. The inspiratory reserve volume, or IRV, is the volume of air that you can forcefully inhale after you inhale tidal volume. And it's a little over 3 liters or 3,000 mils. So it turns out that after you take a normal inhalation, you can suck in a whole bunch more air, and the amount of air that you can take into your lungs beyond tidal volume is the inspiratory reserve volume. The expiratory reserve volume, or ERV, is the volume of air that you can forcefully exhale after you've exhaled your tidal volume. So after you've taken a normal breath and exhaled tidal volume, you can continue to forcefully blow more air out of the lungs, and that volume of air would be the expiratory reserve volume, and it's about 1,200 mils in a guy, less than a female. A capacity is always the sum of 2 or more volumes. The vital capacity is the sum of the IRV, TV, and ERV, and it's the maximum amount of air that can be exhaled after you inhale all that you can. So you would inhale all the air that you possibly can, and then blow all that air out. And the air that you blow out is known as the vital capacity. The vital capacity, consisting of the IRV, TV, and ERV, is somewhere around 4,800 milliliters. Residual volume is RV, and it's the volume of air left in the lungs after you forcefully exhale all that you can. So it turns out that during a forceful exhalation, you can't completely collapse your lungs and blow all the air out of your lungs. There's always some residual air left in the alveoli and the airways that you can't blow out of the lungs. And it's called the residual volume, and it's about 1,200 mils. Total incapacity would be the sum of the vital capacity and the residual volume. And it's the total volume of air that the lungs can hold. is a graph of the lung volumes and capacities that I just went over. So here's tidal volume. It's the amount of air that you take in when you inhale, or the amount of air you blow out when you exhale. So after you've taken a tidal volume, when you inhale, you can still forcefully inhale a whole lot more air. And that amount of air that you can forcefully inhale beyond tidal volume is the inspiratory reserve volume. So we'll blow out the IRV and blow out the TV, and then take another breath. So we'll inhale tidal volume and exhale tidal volume. And at this point, you can still forcefully exhale more air out of your lungs, and the amount that you can forcefully exhale beyond tidal volume is the expiratory reserve volume, from here to there. So no matter how hard you try, you can't blow all the air out of the lungs, and what you can't blow out of the lungs when you forcefully exhale is the residual volume. Vital capacity would be the ERV, TV, and IRV, and the total lung capacity would include all of that, plus the residual volume. So we'll talk a little bit about the control of respiration. And there is a cluster of neurons within the medulla oblongata of the brainstem called the inspiratory center. It's also known as the dorsal respiratory group, or the DRG. The inspiratory center controls the basic rhythm of resting breathing. So the inspiratory neurons that make up the inspiratory center cycle through periods of activity and inactivity. When these neurons are active for about 2 seconds, they send impulses out the axons of somatic motor neurons to contract the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles, and one would inhale. And then these inspiratory neurons, after being active for 2 seconds, become inactive for 3 seconds. And while they're inactive, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles relax, and the lungs deflate by elastic recoil. And then that simply repeats itself again and again and again throughout life. There's a stretch reflex associated with the lungs that helps to prevent them from overinflating, called the Herringbauer stretch reflex. If the lungs overinflate with air, it can stretch the alveolar walls to the point where they split open or break, and that would damage the lungs. So if the lungs overinflate, it will stimulate stretch receptors in the lung that send impulses into the inspiratory center within the medulla oblongata of the brainstem to inhibit the activity of these inspiratory neurons and move them from an active to an inactive state. And that causes the diaphragm and external intercostal muscles to stop contracting, and of course the lungs would deflate by elastic recoil. So it's a built-in reflex associated with stretch receptors in the lungs that helps to prevent overinflation, which might occur during, say, heavy exercise. There are chemoreceptors that control respiration. So we know that breathing is going to vary from a resting state to an exercising state and everything in between. And we know that the changes in our breathing pattern occur automatically. So that suggests the involvement of the autonomic nervous system. And all of this is controlled by chemoreceptors. So chemoreceptors are located primarily in the medulla oblongata of the brainstem, as well as the walls of the aorta and carotid arteries. And the chemoreceptors respond primarily to changes in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood. But they also respond to changes in the hydrogen ion concentration of the blood, as well as the oxygen levels in the blood. But they are most sensitive to changes in carbon dioxide. So just to review this equation again, carbon dioxide that's generated during cellular respiration will react with water to form carbonic acid. And carbonic acid then dissociates or splits apart into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. If the levels of CO2 go up, where you're not getting rid of it by exhaling it away from the body, then accumulating levels of CO2 will drive this reaction to the right and generate excessive numbers of hydrogen ions that will lower the pH towards acidosis. And acidosis can result in enzymes that don't work properly and can lead to death. So, this would be a normal concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood. And let's say you go out and exercise. And when you exercise and step up the metabolism of exercising skeletal muscle, you'll generate more carbon dioxide, and that in turn will lead to an increase in hydrogen ions and a drop of the pH towards acidosis, which you want to prevent. When you exercise, the oxygen demand of skeletal muscle cells increases, and at least temporarily there would be a reduction in the amount of oxygen in the blood that we need to correct as well. So, high levels of CO2, increasing amounts of hydrogen ions, and decreasing amounts of oxygen within the blood will stimulate chemoreceptors, and they in turn send sensory impulses into the inspiratory center within the brainstem and increase the activity of the inspiratory neurons. And that will increase the number of breaths that you take per minute. So you may go from a resting breathing rate of 12 breaths per minute to maybe a breathing rate of 20 breaths per minute during exercise. And of course, this increase in the breathing rate allows you to exhale away the extra CO2, which is the prime stimulus for the chemoreceptors. Of course, it allows you to acquire more oxygen as well. Remember that when we talked about chemoreceptors during the cardiovascular lectures, that these chemoreceptors responding to high levels of CO2 and the others will stimulate the sympathetic centers in the brainstem, the cardio accelerator center and the vasomotor center, and they in turn will change the parameters of the heart, increase heart rate, increase stroke volume, increase contractility, and increase, in this case through the vasomotor center, the peripheral resistance, and all of that leads to an increase in blood pressure, and now you've got more blood flowing through skeletal muscle and flowing through the lungs to get oxygen and get rid of CO2. CO2 levels are the most important regulators of breathing. Just remember that when it comes to questions on quizzes and tests. The blood transports respiratory gases. And when we talk about respiratory gases, we're always talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide. So let's revisit hemoglobin. Hemoglobin, or HP, is a protein with 4 iron-containing heme groups that's found in the cytoplasm of red blood cells. There's about 250 million hemoglobin molecules per red blood cell, and oxygen binds to the iron atoms of the 4 heme groups. So every hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen molecules. And every red blood cell can carry about 1 billion oxygen molecules. So it's really an incredible amount of oxygen that red cells can pick up and carry to the cells of the body. And of course underscores how important oxygen is to ATP production. Definitely make sure you remember that carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions will bind to hemoglobin as well. So let's talk a little bit about the transport of oxygen. About 98% of the oxygen that comes into the blood goes into red blood cells and binds to hemoglobin. So red blood cells carry about 98% of the oxygen that comes into the body, from the lungs to the cells of the body. Very small percentage of oxygen, probably no more than 1.5%, maybe 2% max, as it comes in from the lungs just dissolves into blood plasma and is carried within plasma. When an individual is at rest, the oxygen demands of the cells of the body aren't as high as they would be during exercise. And when an individual is at rest, only about one of the 4 oxygen molecules comes off hemoglobin as blood goes through the systemic capillaries. Hemoglobin, however, gets fully oxygenated with 4 oxygens per hemoglobin as the red cells go through the pulmonary capillaries. So down here, I've got a little table that shows the percent saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. And because hemoglobin molecules pick up as much oxygen as they can possibly hold as red cells go through pulmonary capillaries, the hemoglobin percent saturation in pulmonary veins and systemic arteries would be 100%. Within the systemic venules and veins, after blood has gone through systemic capillaries in a resting state, the hemoglobin would be about 75% saturated, because in general in a resting condition only about one of the 4 oxygen molecules comes off hemoglobin as red cells go through systemic capillaries. But when you exercise, the hemoglobin gives up more of its oxygen because cells are demanding more, and the percent saturation may end up as 20 to 50% in the systemic venules and veins during exercise. In other words, the hemoglobin molecules during exercise are releasing 2 or 3 of their oxygen molecules as they go through systemic capillaries. There's an effect associated with what's called oxygen uncoupling or oxygen unloading called the Bohr effect. And the Bohr effect describes a decrease in the affinity or attractiveness of hemoglobin for oxygen when the hydrogen ion concentration in red blood cells goes up. So remember that the pH is inversely proportional to the hydrogen ion concentration. As the hydrogen ion concentration goes up, the pH goes down. And the Bohr effect states that the pH is inversely proportional to oxygen unloading from hemoglobin. Oxygen unloading is when the oxygen uncouples or falls off hemoglobin inside red cells. And the Bohr effect occurs when hydrogen ions that are generated inside red cells bind to the protein portion of hemoglobin. And the binding of hydrogen ions to hemoglobin weakens the bond between oxygen and the iron atoms of the heme group, so that oxygen falls off more easily than it would otherwise. And this helps to release the oxygen from hemoglobin when red cells go through systemic capillaries. Carbon dioxide transport in the systemic capillaries. So about 7% of the carbon dioxide coming into plasma from the tissue cells dissolves into a plasma. Most of the CO2 coming into the blood goes into red blood cells. So about 23% of the CO2 that the tissue cells make goes into red blood cells and binds to the amino acids of hemoglobin. 70% of the CO2 that cells make ends up being dissolved in plasma as bicarbonate ions. And that's sort of a complicated story, but we're going to tell it. So know that bicarbonate ions are a form of carbon dioxide. And when you see bicarbonate ions, you should see a form of carbon dioxide in blood plasma or in red blood cells. Bicarbonate ions form in red blood cells as the red blood cells go through the systemic capillaries. There is an enzyme in red blood cells called carbonic anhydrase. And it's an enzyme that very rapidly combines carbon dioxide and water to carbonic acid. I want you to know the name of this enzyme. There is a phenomenon associated with bicarbonate ions known as the chloride ion shift. And we're going to find out that as bicarbonate ions leave red cells and go into plasma, chloride ions move from plasma into red blood cells. And this is referred to as the chloride ion shift. And the chloride ion shift helps to maintain electrical neutrality across the red cell membrane. So this would be an illustration showing the transport of carbon dioxide in the systemic capillaries. Here we've got tissue cells that are generating CO2 and acquiring oxygen from the blood, flowing through systemic capillaries. So systemic arterioles deliver blood into a systemic capillary, and the systemic capillaries are drained by systemic venules. The carbon dioxide that cells make as a result of cellular respiration leaves the tissue cells and diffuses across capillary walls into the blood. About 7% of it stays dissolved in plasma and is carried as dissolved carbon dioxide in blood plasma. Most of the CO2 goes into red blood cells. About 23% of the CO2 that cells generate binds to hemoglobin. Most of the CO2, 70% of what cells make, will combine with water inside red blood cells, a reaction that's catalyzed by carbonic anhydrase to form carbonic acid that then dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. The hydrogen ions generated will bind to hemoglobin, and that acts via the Bohr effect to promote the uncoupling of oxygen from hemoglobin that then leaves the red cells and goes into the cells of the body. The bicarbonate ions that result from this reaction represent carbon dioxide, and the bicarbonate ions then would move out of red blood cells into plasma. And as the bicarbonate ions move out, the negatively charged chloride ions move in. This is called the chloride ion shift to maintain electrical neutrality between the cytoplasm of red cells and blood plasma. Carbon dioxide transport in the pulmonary capillaries involves the reverse of what we just saw in the systemic capillaries. So the bicarbonate ions, as blood goes through the pulmonary capillaries, move from plasma into red blood cells. And within red blood cells, the bicarbonate ions that come in react with hydrogen ions coming off hemoglobin to form carbonic acid that then splits into CO2 and water, and the CO2 leaves the red cells as they go through the pulmonary capillaries, goes into the air sacs, and is exhaled. Remember that this reaction is a reversible reaction. So in the pulmonary capillaries, there's a lot of bicarbonate ions coming in, and that's going to drive it in this direction. As bicarbonate ions move into red blood cells, the chloride ions will move out. And this then is called the reverse chloride ion shift. So a chloride ion shift occurs in the systemic capillaries as chloride ions go into red cells, and a reverse chloride ion shift occurs in the pulmonary capillaries where chloride ions move out of red cells into plasma. These changes are occurring with carbon dioxide. Of course, the oxygen is coming in as you inhale and binding to hemoglobin. The CO2 attached to hemoglobin comes off hemoglobin in the pulmonary capillaries, and it would be exhaled. And of course, the CO2 dissolved in blood plasma would move into the air sacs as well and be exhaled. There are a couple conditions of clinical interest that I thought I would mention to include carbon monoxide poisoning. So carbon monoxide is colorless and odorless, and it forms when you burn organic compounds. So when you react organic compounds with oxygen during a burn, and these organics include tobacco, gasoline, kerosene, there are others. But when you react organic compounds with oxygen, you'll generate carbon dioxide and water primarily, plus you'll make some carbon monoxide. So when you smoke a cigarette, you're burning the tobacco, and the burning of tobacco will create some carbon monoxide that you inhale with the tobacco smoke into your lungs. When inhaled, carbon monoxide goes from the lungs into the blood, and from the blood into red blood cells, where carbon monoxide binds very, very tightly to the iron atoms of the heme groups of hemoglobin, and that prevents oxygen from binding to the hemoglobin. And as a result, carbon monoxide will decrease the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. And that produces symptoms like headaches, and you get really sleepy and confused. If you inhale a lot of carbon monoxide, it'll decrease the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood to the point of suffocation and death. We certainly don't want to leave the lungs without talking about smoking. So smoking is a very expensive, addictive, and self-destructive habit. Cigarette smoke contains carcinogens, quite a few of them. Carbon monoxide, poisonous gas, and it also contains tiny little particles called particulate matter that can get into and damage the lungs. Smoking is known to contribute to an increased incidence of lung cancer, atherosclerosis that can lead to heart attacks. Smoking causes emphysema and bronchitis. Smoking will also decrease the effectiveness of the mucociliary elevator because cigarette smoke will damage the cilia and decrease their number. It'll also stimulate the secretion of excess mucus by the goblet cells that acts to kind of clog the airways and the larynx, and can lead to a change in the quality of your voice, as well as a smoker's cough. So smoking will compromise this self-cleansing mechanism of the lungs called the mucociliary elevator. There's a group of lung disorders that are collectively referred to as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. And the COPDs are any disorder of the airways that block airflow through the lungs and make it harder to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide at the level of the alveoli. So patients with COPDs usually have a history of smoking. They're almost, often tied together. The major COPDs are asthma, bronchitis, and emphysema. I just want to say a little bit more about emphysema. Emphysema is a chronic condition, persists once it develops for the rest of your life, and it results in irreversible damage to the alveoli and a decrease in the number of elastic fibers, hence elasticity associated with the lungs. So cigarette smoke is the major cause of emphysema. There are a couple other ways you can develop it. And the symptoms of someone with emphysema would be a great difficulty breathing. They get really, really tired because they can't acquire enough oxygen for the skeletal muscles if they start to move around. I mean, even just a short walk can cause them to be really, really tired. As emphysema progresses, these individuals may need to bring with them a supplemental tank of oxygen. There's two terms that I want you to know: Hyperventilation would be a rapid series of deep breaths that blow off a lot of CO2 and cause CO2 levels in the body to drop. And hyperventilation can occur in response to anxiety or a panic attack. So hyperventilation would be where the body is going rapid series of deep breaths. Hypoventilation is just the opposite. It's slow and shallow breathing, and it can cause CO2 levels in the body to increase. And hypoventilation would be very slow breathing, where each breath is called a shallow breath.